As Alexander Muir, a British soldier in the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, returns home from fighting in the Battle of Ridgeway against the Irish in 1866, he passes a tall maple tree that has stood on his front lawn his whole life. The maple leaf has become increasingly emblematic to Canada. First used by the Francophone Jean-Baptiste Society in Quebec, it became a true symbol of Canada when it was used in decorations for the Prince of Wales' visit to Canada in 1860. It was also adopted by the Royal Canadian 100th Regiment that same year. Muir gets inspired by the great tree and its significance to the land on which he lives, and begins writing what is to become our nation's most endearing song. The Maple Leaf Forever captures the hearts of Canadians from coast to coast. The following year, the Federal Dominion of Canada is formed, and the Maple Leaf Forever is instantly adopted as Canada's new unofficial anthem. The song becomes unpopular with many French Canadians due to its lyrical favoritism towards the British. Alexander begins teaching at a Newmarket elementary school. It isn't until 1874 that the song is performed publicly in front of Governor General Lord Dufferin by Muir's elementary school choir. The following year, a 25-year-old man from Halifax rents out Victoria's skating rink in Montreal and holds the first game of shinny ever to be recorded, now regarded as the birth of organized hockey. Creighton takes out an ad in the Montreal Gazette which reads, "A game of hockey will be played at Victoria's skating rink this evening between two nines chose from among the members. Good fun may be expected as some of the players are reputed to be exceedingly expert at the game. Some fears have been expressed on the part of intending spectators that accidents were likely to occur through the ball flying about in too lively a manner to the imminent danger of lookers-on. But we understand that the game will be played with a flat circular piece of wood, thus preventing all danger of its leaving the surface of the ice. Subscribers will be admitted on presentation of their tickets." Creighton makes two revolutionary changes in the game of ice hockey. He establishes a concrete set of rules and replaces the ball with a wooden puck. The game draws a crowd larger than expected, many of whom were said to be quite entertained by the fast action. Although it is the French-Canadian city of Montreal that harbors the first game of ice hockey, it is in a building named after the Queen of England. Like many modern hockey games, the spectators were witness to a fight after the game. Not between the two combatants, but between the other recreational skaters of the rink against both teams' players over the game's damage to the ice surface. In 1876, Canada begins printing maple leafs on all their coins. One decade later, the game of hockey blossoms as amateur leagues are formed in Ontario and Quebec. Both leagues would have teams that marketed themselves towards certain ethnic groups. For instance, the early AHA had the Montreal Shamrocks to represent the Irish, the Montreal Victorias to represent the English, and the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association, or AAA, to represent the French. The French-English feud had taken to the ice for the first time in its history as crosstown rivalries emerged. In 1888, Lord Stanley of Preston arrives in Ottawa to take his new position as Governor General. He instantly falls in love with the game, as does his family. The Stanleys travel quite often and see that the game is embraced in nearly every city and town in Canada. In 1890, the Ontario Hockey Association is formed and two of his sons, Algernon and Arthur, join the Rideau Rebels, playing alongside none other than the father of organized hockey himself, James Creighton. For the first time in hockey history, Montreal meets Toronto on skates in the OHA. It is the Montreal St. James Club that would take on one of Toronto's several hockey clubs, the Toronto Granites, Toronto Newfort, the Toronto Victorias, the Toronto St. George's, and the Toronto Athletics. Between the two frontrunner leagues, the AHA of Quebec and the OHA of Ontario, Montreal and Toronto boast at least three or more teams every year and are clearly the largest fan bases in Canada. Algernon and Arthur suggest to their father that there should be a trophy that is contested for by all winning teams of every league across Canada. Stanley agrees, and the Holy Grail of hockey is born. Lord Stanley contacts a silversmith in Sheffield and orders a cup to be delivered to Ottawa that displays his family's royal crest. The The Dominion Challenge Cup, as it was then called, was sent in 1893 and seen as a symbol of worldwide hockey supremacy. The Stanley family would travel back to England that very year, never to return again, leaving behind what is now Canada's most cherished possession. French Canadians felt passionately about hockey, with good reason. Their Montreal AAA had gone on an 18-game winning streak that lasted over 2 seasons, and in the first year of the Cup's contention, they were awarded the Cup based on their first-place finish in the AHA, unchallenged by any other leagues. The next year, 4 of the 5 teams in the AHA were tied atop the standings, and the first ever Stanley Cup playoff matchup was held between the French AAA and the English Vix, as the 2 Montreal clubs were pitted against each other. The AAA went on to win the league title and were challenged by OHA champions Osgoode Hall of Toronto in what would have been the first ever Montreal-Toronto Stanley Cup final, but by late March, the match was cancelled due to lack of ice, and the AAA were crowned back-to-back world champions. Over the next decade, the Cup was won by only Montreal and Winnipeg clubs. The Wellingtons became the first Toronto club to challenge for the Cup, losing 5-3 in both games of a best-of-3 series to the Winnipeg Vix in 1902. The Toronto Marlboros challenged the Ottawa Silver 7 2 years later, losing to a combined score of 17-5 in 2 games. In 1908, the Montreal Wanderers had defeated the Ottawa Vix and, ironically, the Winnipeg Maple Leafs before they were hesitant to forfeit the Cup to Toronto, challenging third. Refusing to travel to Toronto to complete a home-and-home series, Montreal President Jennings said, "They don't seem to appreciate in Toronto that the Montreal public are weary of hockey. The second Maple Leaf match will be the 22nd in which our players have figured this season. We will leave it to the players to decide, but most of us feel inclined to send the Cup to Toronto and let them have it and be done with it." Toronto agrees to a single game in Montreal, and on March 14th, the first ever Stanley Cup showdown between Montreal and Toronto is held, with the Wanderers winning 6-4. This small dispute would foreshadow a future beef between Toronto and the Wanderers. The Wanderers were Anglo-based, and when the Francophone Montreal AAA folded in 1909, there was no club to represent French Canadians. In November, the Renfrew Creamery Kings owner was in Montreal and met with the Wanderers owner, who suggested he create a Francophone team to replace the AAA in the thriving crosstown rivalry. Francophone hockey players were outnumbered at the time to Anglophone players. The Montreal Gazette even posted an article that said French Canadian players of class were not as numerous. On December 4th, Les Canadiens were formed, financed by the Renfrew owner. He immediately stocked the team with French stars Georges Paulin, Didier Pitre, and most notably the Francophone superstar 22-year-old Newsy Lalonde. The Canadiens played their first game ever on January 5th, 1910 to a sellout crowd of 3,000. That night they defeated Cobalt in overtime 7-6, wearing a blue sweater with a large white C on the chest and a white line that went through it horizontally. The league expanded 2 weeks later and the season was restarted. The Canadiens ended up in last place while the Wanderers went on to win the Stanley Cup. At this time, there was no suitable arena in Toronto to hold a hockey team, and in 1911, construction went underway to build the largest artificial rink in Canada, which was to hold 7,500 spectators for hockey games. Construction was delayed and the arena couldn't open until the following year. When Arena Gardens finally did open, it hosted numerous musical performances from many orchestras and opera singers in its opening week, in what was to become the first annual Toronto Music Festival. The first hockey game held there was an exhibition game between the Canadiens and the Wanderers. Sprague Cleghorn was suspended 4 weeks and fined $65 for assaulting the French sensation Newsy Lalonde. Toronto entered the league with 2 teams, the Tecumsehs and the team that would go through many hands before eventually becoming the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Toronto Hockey Club. Toronto's first matchup was against the Montreal Canadiens on Christmas Day 1912 in front of 4,000 fans. Montreal won the match 9-5. The Toronto club soon became known as the Blue Shirts, as they finished the season in a 3-way tie for third with the Ottawa Senators and the Canadiens. They tied the Montreal Canadiens again the following year. This time it was for the top spot in the league, which forced the first ever Stanley Cup playoffs between the two iconic franchises. A home-and-home series was held to decide the winner. George Vezina posted a shutout for the Canadiens' 2-0 victory in the first game, but Hap Holmes responded with a shutout in the second games for a Blue Shirts 6-0 victory, which also won them the total goals series. They then went on to defeat the Victoria Cougars to become the 1914 Stanley Cup champions, wearing a blue sweater with a large white T in the middle. Toronto's first Stanley Cup in history. The 1916 Canadiens owner sold the team to a new owner who kept the name but changed the sweater to its iconic red with a blue stripe. He added an A inside the C on the chest, as the team was now referred to the Canadian Athletic Club. Winning the league that year, they played the Portland Rosebuds for the Cup in the first ever best-of-5 series, which was settled in Game 5 when Goldie Progers broke a 1-1 tie late in the third period with a dazzling end-to-end rush to win the Montreal Canadiens their first Stanley Cup. Vezina started a tradition by placing his infant son in the cup for a photograph. During the First World War, the Canadian Expeditionary Force included the maple leaf in their official badge, as well as being used in many ways throughout the Canadian military. Many teams donated the proceeds to the war effort as well as the Red Cross. Numerous players left the league to fight overseas. The league was also subject to a player raid by the Pacific Coast Hockey League. To compensate for the lack of talent, the owner of the Blue Shirts, Eddie Livingstone, who also owns the Toronto Shamrocks, merges the remaining players of the two teams onto the Blue Shirts, allowing the Shamrocks to go dormant. This puts the league at 3 teams, and the 228th Battalion, who was stationed in Toronto at the time, it was invited to join the league to fill the spot of the dormant team. When the 228th Battalion was called to serve, they left abruptly, and the league had just 3 teams again. Livingstone attempted to sue them to no success. Livingstone had been infuriating the rest of the owners that season, and their request to have him thrown out had been denied. He was particularly disliked by the owner of the Wanderers, who was said to have offered him thousands to withdraw the Blue Shirts from the league, only to have Livingstone counteroffer twice as much to see the Wanderers leave. The Wanderers had earlier offered to replay an unfair game against the Blue Shirts, and when the race for first got tight later in the season, they failed to honor the agreement. After many tedious lawsuits and complaints to the league, the Wanderers owner met in a Montreal hotel with the Quebec and Ottawa owners and discussed creating a new league with a few rule changes, including adding the penalty shot, allowing goalies to assume any position to make a save, and another rule being that Eddie Livingstone may not be affiliated in any way with the new league. They called their league the NHL. The Wanderers owner happily told a reporter, "We didn't throw Livingstone out. He still got his franchise in the old league. The only problem is he's playing in a one-team league." The NHL granted a temporary franchise to the Toronto Arena Company. 5 of the 8 original Blue Shirts joined the Arena Company's team, Harry Cameron being the only player remaining on Toronto who won the Cup with them 4 years earlier. The first few deals made bring back Hap Holmes, who played for the 1914 Cup-winning team. Not technically the same team, but with 6 of the same players on an 8-man team in the same city wearing the same sweaters. The team ends up adopting the name the Arenas, being owned by the Arena Gardens Company. The Quebec Bulldogs chose not to play in their first year, and their players went to the remaining teams. The Canadiens picked up French superstar Joe Malone, who scored 5 goals in the Canadiens' first NHL game. The Toronto Arenas played their first NHL game against the Wanderers in a high-scoring 10-9 loss at Westmount Arena. That was to be the Wanderers' only NHL win, as the Westmount Arena burnt down on January 2nd, 1918, and they folded. The Canadiens were in first place at the time, and the season was restarted. It was deemed if the Canadiens won again, they would undoubtedly be the NHL champions. And if Toronto or Ottawa won, the only other teams in the NHL, they would play the Canadiens in a home-and-home total goals series. Just a few games into the season, Toronto's Alf Skinner took up a stick-swinging duel with legendary Joe Hall of the Canadiens. After the game, both players were charged by Toronto police. The Toronto Arenas ended up winning the second season, pitting the future rivals against each other for their second ever Stanley Cup playoff series. Montreal star Joe Malone amassed an astounding 44 goals in the 20-game season, a scoring pace that will likely never be matched. One would have to score 181 goals in today's 82-game schedule to top Malone's record. The Arenas win the first match 7-3 and lose the second by 1 goal, 4-3, meaning Toronto wins by total goals. They would go on to defeat Cyclone Taylor and the Vancouver Millionaires in Game 5 of a 5-game series, with Corb Denny scoring the game-winning goal just past the 10-minute mark in the third. In the NHL's second season, it was the Canadiens who came out on top of the 3-team league. They accepted a challenge from Seattle and scheduled a best-of-5 series. Game 4 was declared a tie, as the game failed to produce a single goal by the end of the first 20-minute overtime period, being the second longest game in Stanley Cup history at that point. The longest Stanley Cup game also resulting in a tie after 27 minutes of overtime. The Canadiens evened up the series in Game 5, and tragedy struck before the teams could play the rubber match. Every player on the Canadiens was hospitalized with the flu except Odie Cleghorn, as well as many Seattle players. Veteran Joe Hall lost his life to pneumonia while in the hospital, and the series being tied was cancelled. Lalonde and 2 other players traveled to Manitoba to act as pallbearers in Hall's funeral. Both team names were engraved on the cup's shoulder atop the words "Series Not Completed." For the first time since 1893, the Stanley Cup was not hoisted, and no city could claim ownership.